December 3, 1945, Camp Philip Morris, Le Havre, France. A young woman named Marie Blanchard stood frozen before a table laden with white bread, butter, and roasted chicken. Her hands trembled as she reached forward, then pulled back. "Is this real?" she whispered to the American soldier serving her. "Take as much as you want, ma'am," he replied in broken French. Marie's eyes filled with tears. She had not seen butter in 4 years. The bread was soft, not the sawdust mixture Paris had survived on. And the meat, actual meat, sat steaming in portions she could not have imagined during the darkest days of occupation. This was not a dream. This was America's promise made tangible. The contrast between wartime France and American abundance was not merely economic, it was civilizational. While French families had rationed 250 grams of bread per person per day, American soldiers ate fresh rolls with every meal. While Parisian mothers boiled potato peels to feed their children, U.S. mess halls discarded more food in a week than some French towns saw in a month. The gap was so vast that when French civilians first encountered American military camps, many could not comprehend what they were seeing. Tables overflowing with food seemed like propaganda. Yet it was real, and it broke something inside those who had survived on nothing. France had entered the war as a nation of abundance. Its farmlands produced wheat, dairy, wine, and livestock that fed millions. But by 1940, that world had vanished. The German occupation transformed France into a land of perpetual hunger. Ration cards determined survival, black markets flourished, and every day became a calculation of calories versus dignity. By 1944, the average Parisian consumed fewer than 1,200 calories daily, half of what the human body requires for normal function. Children stopped growing. Women stopped menstruating. The elderly simply faded away in their sleep, their bodies too weak to continue. The statistics tell only part of the story. Factually, France's food production dropped by 40% during the occupation. German requisitions took another 20% of what remained. What the French ate in 1944 bore no resemblance to food as they had known it. Bread was made from chestnuts, acorns, and sawdust mixed with minimal flour. Meat disappeared entirely from most tables. A chicken became worth a month's wages. Butter, once a staple of French cuisine, became a memory whispered about in kitchens where mothers tried to explain to their children what richness tasted like. Germaine Leclerc, a schoolteacher from Rouen, kept a diary throughout the occupation. In January 1943, she wrote, "Today I traded my wedding ring for 6 eggs and a cup of lard. My husband would understand. The children must eat." Her entry was not unique. Across France, families dismantled their lives piece by piece, trading heirlooms for sustenance, selling furniture for flour, burning books to stay warm. The war had reduced existence to its most primitive equation: survival at any cost. By the time American forces liberated France in the summer of 1944, the population had been starving for 4 years. Liberation brought freedom, but not food. The infrastructure was shattered. Railways had been bombed. Bridges lay in ruins. Farms had been stripped of livestock and machinery. Even after the Germans retreated, hunger remained. France could not feed itself, and without outside help, thousands would continue to die of malnutrition and disease. The French government estimated that restoring pre-war food production would take a decade. The people did not have a decade. They had weeks, perhaps months, before widespread famines set in. This is where America entered not just as a military power, but as a humanitarian force. The contrast was immediate and staggering. American supply convoys rolled into France carrying not only ammunition and fuel, but tons of food. Canned goods, powdered milk, chocolate, coffee, meat, bread, and vegetables arrived in quantities that seemed impossible. To soldiers who had grown up during the Great Depression, these rations were ordinary. To the French, They were miraculous. Camp Philip Morris, established near Le Havre in late 1945, became one of several transit centers where French civilians, particularly women and children, received aid before emigrating to the United States or reuniting with family members. These camps were not internment facilities. They were processing centers, places where paperwork was completed, medical exams conducted, and most importantly, where people were fed. The U.S. Army operated them with the same logistical precision it applied to warfare. 3 meals a day, every day, with portion sizes that shocked French sensibilities. Marie Blanchard was among the first wave of French war brides processed through Camp Philip Morris. She had married an American soldier, Corporal James Whitman, in October 1945. He had returned to the States ahead of her, and she was waiting for her visa and transport. Her story was common. Thousands of French women had fallen in love with American liberators, men who represented not just freedom, but a world where hunger did not define daily life. Marie had spent the occupation years in Paris, working in a textile factory and living on rations that barely sustained her. When she arrived at the camp and saw the mess hall, she thought there had been a mistake. The first meal service was held on the evening of December 3rd. Over 200 women and children lined up outside the dining hall, unsure of what to expect. Inside, long tables had been set with trays, utensils, and cups. American cooks stood behind serving counters, ladling out portions of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread rolls, butter, and apple pie. There was milk for the children and coffee for the adults. One woman, Claudette Moreau, later recalled, "I thought it was for the soldiers, and we would get something else. I did not understand that this was for us." When the women realized the food was theirs, the reaction was visceral. Some cried silently, tears streaming down their faces as they filled their plates. Others stood paralyzed, unable to process the abundance. A few refused to take more than a single roll, convinced there would not be enough for everyone else. The American staff, many of whom had never witnessed true starvation, struggled to understand the hesitation. "Take more," they urged, "there's plenty." But for women who had spent years fighting for scraps, the concept of plenty had ceased to exist. Marie Blanchard took a single piece of chicken, a spoonful of potatoes, and one roll. She sat at a table and stared at her plate. The woman beside her, Elise Durant, touched the butter with her finger, then brought it to her lips as if tasting something sacred. "I forgot what this was," Elise whispered. Around the hall, children ate in silence, their eyes wide, their movements cautious. They had been taught to eat slowly, to make every bite last. Now, confronted with more food than they could finish, they did not know how to respond. The camp commander, Major Robert Hensley, watched from the doorway. He had overseen the setup of the facility and had been briefed on the conditions in France, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of women weeping over bread. In a letter to his wife in Ohio, he wrote, "Today I saw something I will never forget. We served dinner to a group of French women, and they cried. Not from joy exactly, but from something deeper. It was as if we had given them back their humanity." Factually, the U.S. Army provided each person in the camp with approximately 3,500 calories per day, more than double what most had consumed during the occupation. Breakfast included eggs, bacon, toast, jam, and coffee. Lunch featured sandwiches, soup, and fruit. Dinner was a full meal with meat, vegetables, bread, and dessert. Snacks were available throughout the day. The goal was not simply to feed people, but to restore their health. Many of the women arrived malnourished, their bodies weakened by years of deprivation. Army doctors monitored their progress, adjusting diets to ensure safe weight gain. The abundance was not without consequences. Several women became ill after their first meals, their digestive systems unable to process rich food. Nurses had to intervene, instructing them to eat smaller portions more frequently. "Your body needs time to remember how to eat," one nurse explained. It was a strange sentence, but it was true. Starvation had altered their physiology. What should have been nourishing made them sick. By the end of the first week, the women began to adjust. They learned to trust that the food would not run out. They started taking second helpings. Children, who had been silent and withdrawn, began to laugh again. The sound of their laughter echoed through the camp, a sound that had been absent from France for far too long. Marie Blanchard wrote to her husband, "I ate butter today, James, real butter. I had forgotten it existed. I cried like a child. The others did too. We are not starving anymore, but we do not yet know how to live without fear." The transformation was not just physical, but psychological. For years, hunger had been the dominant fact of existence. Every decision revolved around food, where to find it, how to afford it, how to make it last. Now, in the camp, that burden was lifted. Women who had spent the war scavenging and scheming could simply eat. The relief was profound, but so was the disorientation. Some described feeling guilty for having enough. Others could not shake the instinct to hoard. One woman hid bread rolls under her mattress, unable to believe they would still be there tomorrow. The American soldiers stationed at the camp struggled to understand. Most were young men from farms and small towns, places where food was never scarce. They had grown up during the Depression, yes, but even then there had been something to eat. The complete collapse of a food system was outside their experience. "Why are they crying?" one private asked his sergeant. "Because they're happy," his sergeant replied. But that was not quite right. They were crying because the absence of hunger felt unreal, because abundance seemed like a betrayal of those who had not survived, because relief and grief are inseparable. The camp operated on a strict schedule. Wake up at 0700, breakfast at 0800, medical exams and paperwork during the day, lunch at 1200, free time in the afternoon, dinner at 1800, lights out at 2200. The routine provided structure, something many of the women craved after years of chaos. But the meals remained the focal point of each day. No matter how much they ate, the sight of a full table still drew gasps. Butter, in particular, became a symbol. In France, butter had been the first thing to disappear, and the last thing anyone expected to see again. Here, it sat in small dishes at every table, available without limit. Elise Durant, the woman who had touched the butter that first night, came from a village near Caen. Her husband had been killed in 1944 during the Normandy invasion. She was traveling to the United States to live with her sister, who had immigrated before the war. Elise had 2 children, both under the age of 6. During the occupation, she had kept them alive by trading everything she owned. By the time liberation came, she had nothing left but the clothes on her back. At Camp Philip Morris, she watched her children eat with an expression that Major Hensley described as part gratitude, part disbelief. "They are eating meat," Elise said to a nurse one evening. "I did not think I would see them eat meat again." The nurse, a woman from Michigan named Dorothy Palmer, placed a hand on Elise's shoulder. "They'll eat meat every day here," Dorothy said. Elise shook her head slowly. "Every day," she repeated, as if testing the words. "Every day." The contrast between what France had endured and what America offered was not lost on anyone. French newspapers, beginning to publish again after liberation, ran stories about the camps. One headline in Le Figaro read, "In American hands, France eats again." The article described the meals, the medical care, and the tears. It quoted Marie Blanchard, "I did not know there was still a world where people did not count every crumb." The story resonated across the country. For a population still struggling with rationing and shortages, the image of abundance in the American camps became a symbol of hope. Yet the abundance also highlighted the depth of the gap between the two nations. America had fought the war with one hand while feeding its people with the other. Its farms had produced record harvests. Its factories had run at full capacity. Rationing existed in the United States, yes, but it was mild compared to Europe. Americans complained about limited sugar and butter, but no one starved. The same nation that built thousands of tanks and ships also ensured that its soldiers overseas ate fresh bread and hot coffee. That logistical capacity, the ability to project both violence and sustenance across an ocean, was something no other country possessed. France, by contrast, had been broken. Its infrastructure destroyed, its economy shattered, its people exhausted. The war had taken everything, and recovery would be slow. The women at Camp Philip Morris represented a small fraction of the population, but their stories reflected the larger truth. France had survived, but survival had cost more than anyone could quantify. The tears shed over bread and butter were not just about food. They were about loss, endurance, and the fragile hope that life might one day return to normal. By mid-December, over 500 women and children had passed through Camp Philip Morris. Each one experienced the same shock, the same disbelief, the same tears. The American staff grew accustomed to it, but they never stopped being moved. You give them a plate of food, and they look at you like you've performed a miracle, one cook said. It's just chicken and potatoes, but to them, it's everything. The camp became a microcosm of the larger story, a place where the two worlds collided. On one side, the France of deprivation, occupation, and survival. On the other, the America of machinery, abundance, and confidence. The women who passed through carried both worlds within them. They would travel to a new country, start new lives, and try to forget the hunger. But the memory would remain, etched into their bodies and minds. And whenever they sat down to a meal, they would remember the first time they cried over bread. January 1946, Camp Lucky Strike, St. Valery in Co, Normandy. The second wave of French war brides arrived by train. Over 800 women and children stepping onto the platform with tattered suitcases and cardboard boxes tied with string. They had been traveling for 2 days, sleeping in unheated railway cars, surviving on the small rations they had brought from home. As they entered the camp gates, the smell of cooking food reached them. Fresh bread, frying bacon, coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute they had drunk for 5 years. Isabelle Fontaine, a seamstress from Lyon, stopped walking. "That smell," she said to her sister. "I thought I had imagined it." Camp Lucky Strike was larger than Philip Morris, designed to process up to 2,000 people at a time. It had been a staging area for American troops waiting to return home after the war, and now it served a different purpose, preparing French women for their journey to America. The camp sprawled across former farmland with rows of Quonset huts, administrative buildings, a medical facility, and a massive mess hall that could seat 500 people at once. Everything was organized with military efficiency. Arrival processing took 3 hours. Medical examinations followed. Then came the first meal. The mess hall at Camp Lucky Strike operated on a scale that defied European understanding. Army cooks prepared 1,500 meals 3 times daily, using ingredients shipped directly from the United States. Powdered eggs arrived in 50-pound bags. Bacon came in crates. Flour, sugar, coffee, and canned vegetables filled an entire warehouse. The kitchen staff, a mix of American soldiers and French civilian workers, operated with the precision of a factory. By 1800 hours, dinner was ready. Pork chops, roasted potatoes, carrots, white bread, butter, chocolate pudding, and milk. The portions were not symbolic, they were substantial, designed to restore health and weight to people who had been starving. Isabelle Fontaine stood in line with her sister Thérèse and Thérèse's 3 children. The youngest, a boy named Luc, was 4 years old. He had been born in 1941 during the darkest period of the occupation. He had never known abundance. His entire life had been measured in ration cards and empty cupboards. When the serving soldier placed a pork chop on his tray, Luc stared at it without moving. "Is it real?" he asked his mother. Thérèse knelt beside him, tears already forming. "Yes, mon petit, it is real. The reaction in the mess hall that evening was the same as it had been at Philip Morris, but multiplied across hundreds of faces. Women wept openly. Children ate in stunned silence. Some refused to take second helpings, convinced there would not be enough. Others filled their plates and then could not bring themselves to eat, overwhelmed by the sight of so much food. An American chaplain, Captain William Morris, walked among the tables, offering comfort. He had served in France during the liberation and had seen the devastation firsthand, but even he was unprepared for the depth of emotion triggered by a simple meal. In his report to headquarters, Captain Morris wrote, "The women do not cry from happiness, they cry from relief, from exhaustion, from the realization that the worst is over. Food is not just sustenance to them, it is proof that they have survived." His observation was accurate. For the French women at Camp Lucky Strike, the meals represented something beyond nutrition. They were evidence of a world where hunger did not rule, where tomorrow was not a question of survival, but of possibility. Factually, the camps operated at a cost of approximately $2.50 per person per day, a figure that included food, medical care, and administrative expenses. The U.S. military had allocated over $3 million for the operation of transit camps across France, processing an estimated 50,000 French war brides and their children between 1945 and 1947. The program was part of a larger humanitarian effort that included food shipments, medical aid, and infrastructure repair. America was not simply feeding individuals, it was feeding a nation. The scale of American food production during and after the war was staggering. While France struggled to produce enough wheat to feed its population, the United States harvested record crops. In 1945 alone, American farms produced over 1.1 billion bushels of wheat, much of it destined for Europe. Livestock production remained high despite the demands of the military. Meat, which had disappeared from French tables, was so abundant in America that rationing was minimal and often ignored. The disparity was not just a matter of resources, it was structural. America's agricultural system had been mechanized for decades. Tractors, combines, and irrigation had transformed farming into an industrial process. France, by contrast, still relied heavily on manual labor and traditional methods. The war had destroyed what little mechanization existed. At Camp Lucky Strike, the women began to understand the depth of this gap. Conversations in the barracks revealed a shared disbelief. "In America, they throw away more food than we ate in a year," one woman said. Another responded, "I do not believe it." But the evidence was everywhere. The kitchen staff scraped leftover food into bins at the end of each meal. Bread that was a day old was discarded. Milk that had been opened but not finished was poured out. To the French women, this was incomprehensible. Waste on such a scale seemed immoral, even obscene. Yet it was standard practice in a country where abundance was assumed. Isabelle Fontaine struggled with this more than most. She had spent the occupation years in Lyon, one of the cities hit hardest by food shortages. Her husband, a railway worker, had been killed in 1943 during an Allied bombing raid. She had survived by sewing for wealthier families, trading her labor for food. By 1944, she was eating one meal a day, and that meal often consisted of watery soup and a crust of bread. When liberation came, she met Sergeant Daniel Cooper, an American soldier from Kansas. They married in October 1945. Daniel returned to the States, and Isabelle waited for her papers. Now, sitting in the mess hall at Camp Lucky Strike, she watched American soldiers laugh and talk as they ate, oblivious to the miracle on their plates. "They do not know what they have," Isabelle said to her sister. Therese nodded. "They have never been hungry. How could they know?" It was a simple truth, but it explained everything. The American soldiers stationed at the camps were kind and generous, but they could not comprehend deprivation they had never experienced. To them, food was background noise, something that simply appeared. To the French women, food was the foreground, the thing that defined every moment of the past 5 years. The medical examinations at Camp Lucky Strike revealed the physical cost of starvation. Dr. Helen Baxter, an Army physician from Massachusetts, examined over 300 women during her time at the camp. Her notes documented the damage: malnutrition-related anemia, bone density loss, dental decay, vitamin deficiencies, and in some cases, irreversible damage to internal organs. These women are not sick in the traditional sense, Dr. Baxter wrote. They are depleted. Their bodies have been running on empty for so long that recovery will take years, not months. Children suffered even more. Growth had been stunted in many cases. A 6-year-old might weigh what a 3-year-old should. Teeth had come in weak or not at all. Some children exhibited developmental delays caused by chronic malnutrition during critical growth periods. Dr. Baxter worked with the kitchen staff to create special meal plans for the most severely affected cases, gradually increasing caloric intake to avoid overwhelming fragile digestive systems. "We are not just feeding them," she explained to the camp commander. "We are rebuilding them." The psychological impact was equally profound. Many of the women exhibited symptoms of what would later be recognized as trauma. They hoarded food, hiding bread in their belongings, even though meals were guaranteed. They ate quickly, as if someone might take the food away. They could not relax during meals, constantly scanning the room for threats. Nurses and social workers at the camp tried to provide reassurance, but habits formed over 5 years of survival could not be undone in a few weeks. One evening, a social worker named Margaret Winters sat with a group of women in the barracks. They had been at the camp for nearly 2 weeks, and most had gained weight and color, but the fear remained. "You are safe here," Margaret told them. "The food will not run out." A woman named Colette Rousseau shook her head. "I know this in my mind," she tapped her forehead, "but my body does not believe it." The others murmured in agreement. Their bodies had been trained by hunger. Untraining them would take time. By February 1946, the camps had processed thousands of women and children. The stories were remarkably similar. Tears at the first meal, disbelief at the abundance, slow recovery of trust. But beneath these individual stories was a larger narrative, one that contrasted two nations at opposite ends of the spectrum. America had emerged from the war stronger, richer, and more confident. France had emerged broken, impoverished, and uncertain. The camps were a microcosm of this divide, places where the two realities collided and where the future was being written one meal at a time. The women who passed through the camps would soon board ships to America, carrying with them memories of hunger and loss. They would arrive in a country where supermarkets overflowed with food, where restaurants served portions that seemed obscene, where waste was a given. Some would adapt quickly. Others would struggle for decades, unable to shake the instinct to save every scrap, to fear the empty cupboard. Their children, born in America, would grow up hearing stories of the war, of the hunger, of the camps where their mothers first learned to eat again. Those stories would become family legend, passed down through generations, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Camp Lucky Strike continued operations until late 1947, when the last of the war brides departed. By then, over 15,000 women and children had been processed through its facilities. The camp was dismantled, the buildings repurposed or torn down, and the land returned to farming. But the legacy remained. In Kansas and Ohio, in Michigan and California, French women built new lives, carrying within them the memory of that first meal. They would never take food for granted again. March 1946. Aboard the USS Henry Gibbons, mid-Atlantic. Isabelle Fontaine stood at the ship's railing, watching the gray water roll beneath an overcast sky. She was 3 days into the voyage to New York, and seasickness had claimed most of the passengers. But she remained on deck, grateful for the fresh air and the solitude. Below, in the ship's mess, lunch was being served. Sandwiches, fruit, soup, and cookies. Even on a military transport ship, the food was better than anything she had eaten during the war. She thought about her first meal at Camp Lucky Strike, the pork chop that had made her cry, the bread that had tasted like a memory of her childhood. She thought about her sister still in France and the children who were learning to eat without fear. The voyage took 8 days. The ship carried 1,200 passengers, mostly war brides and their children, along with a few hundred American soldiers returning home. The conditions were cramped, the seas rough, and the accommodations basic. But the food never stopped. 3 meals a day, every day, prepared in the ship's galley and served in shifts. For many of the French women, it was their first experience of sustained abundance. They no longer cried at meals. They had learned to accept, though not yet to expect, that there would always be more. Isabelle shared a cabin with 5 other women and their children. At night, they talked about their husbands, about the lives they would build in America, about the fear and excitement of starting over. One woman, Simone Petit, admitted she was terrified. What if I cannot adjust? What if I am always remembering? Isabelle had no answer. She felt the same fear. The past was too heavy to simply leave behind. It would travel with them, a shadow that no amount of food or safety could erase.
On March 15, 1946, the USS Henry Gibbons entered New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty emerged from the morning mist, her torch raised against a pale sky. The women crowded onto the deck, children in their arms, eyes fixed on the skyline of Manhattan. Isabelle felt her breath catch. She had imagined this moment for months, but the reality was more overwhelming than any fantasy. This was America. This was the country that had fed her when France could not. This was the place where her new life would begin. The ship docked at Pier 84, and the passengers disembarked slowly, processing through customs and immigration. Husbands waited on the dock, holding signs, scanning faces, searching for wives they had not seen in months. Daniel Cooper found Isabelle in the crowd, and they embraced without words. He had gained weight since she last saw him, his face fuller, healthier. She wondered if she looked different to him, if he could see the years of hunger still etched into her body. "You made it," he said. She nodded. "I made it." They took a train to Kansas, a journey that lasted 2 days and crossed a landscape Isabelle could not comprehend. Endless fields of wheat, cattle grazing in pastures, towns that looked untouched by war. Everything was intact, nothing was ruined. The train stopped in small stations where vendors sold sandwiches, coffee, and fruit. Isabelle bought an apple, not because she was hungry, but because she could. Daniel watched her eat it slowly, savoring every bite. "You don't have to save it," he said gently. "There are more apples." She smiled but did not answer. He did not understand. There would always be a part of her that saved the apple. They arrived in Topeka on March 18th, and Daniel's family met them at the station. His mother, a sturdy woman named Dorothy, hugged Isabelle and welcomed her in slow, careful English. The house was modest, a 2-story farmhouse surrounded by fields. Inside, the kitchen was warm, and the smell of roasting chicken filled the air. Dorothy had prepared a feast: mashed potatoes, green beans, biscuits, gravy, and pie. She had wanted to make Isabelle feel welcome, to show her that she was home. But when Isabelle saw the table, she began to cry, not from joy but from the weight of it all, the abundance, the kindness, the unbearable contrast with everything she had lost. Dorothy did not understand, but she held Isabelle anyway, patting her back and murmuring reassurances. Daniel stood in the doorway, helpless. Later, he would tell his mother about the camps, about the hunger, about the tears over bread. Dorothy would nod and say, "We must be patient with her." And they were. Over the following months and years, they watched as Isabelle slowly learned to live in a world where food was not a struggle. She learned to shop at American supermarkets, where shelves stretched endlessly and choices overwhelmed her. She learned to cook with ingredients she had not seen since childhood. She learned to throw away leftovers, though it never stopped feeling wrong. By 1950, Isabelle had 3 children of her own, all born in America. Robert came first in 1947, followed by Catherine in 1949, and Marie in 1950, named after a friend Isabelle had lost during the occupation. She told them stories about France, about the war, about the hunger. At dinner, when Robert left food on his plate, she would grow quiet, her fork suspended in mid-air, her eyes distant. "In France," she would say softly, "we would have fought over what you are leaving." She taught them never to waste food, to appreciate every meal, to understand that abundance was not universal. She made them finish their vegetables, scrape their plates clean, save leftovers in carefully wrapped packages. When Catherine complained about having beans again, Isabelle's voice would harden. "You do not know what it means to want beans and have none." Her children listened, but they did not truly understand. They rolled their eyes when she insisted on saving half-empty jars of jam. They whispered to each other when she retrieved bruised apples from the trash. They had never been hungry. How could they? They were American, born into a world where food was assumed, where scarcity was theoretical, where the idea of crying over bread seemed strange and distant. Daniel watched his wife struggle to bridge the gap between her past and their present. He saw how she tensed when the pantry ran low, even though the grocery store was 2 miles away and always open. He noticed how she bought extra flour and sugar whenever they were on sale, stockpiling supplies in the basement as if preparing for a siege that would never come. "We have enough," he would tell her gently. "I know," she would reply, but her hands would continue filling the cart. At night, sometimes she would wake from dreams of empty markets and ration lines, her heart racing, her breath short. Daniel would hold her until the fear passed, but he could not erase what she had lived through. No one could. Isabelle never returned to France. The memories were too painful, the loss too great. Her sister Therese wrote letters describing the reconstruction, the new buildings rising where ruins had stood, the economy slowly recovering. "You should come home," Therese wrote in 1952. "It is different now. There is food again." But Isabelle knew she could never go back. France meant occupation, hunger, her husband's death, the years of surviving on nothing. America meant safety, abundance, Daniel, her children. The choice had been made, and there was no reversing it. She carried France within her, though, in the way she cooked, carefully measuring ingredients and wasting nothing. In the language she spoke at home, teaching her children French phrases they would rarely use. In the fear that never fully left her, the instinct to hoard and save that no amount of American plenty could erase. She was one of thousands, scattered across America, women who had survived the war and crossed an ocean to build new lives. They gathered sometimes, these French war brides, at church socials or community centers, speaking their native language and sharing recipes that reminded them of home. In these moments, they did not have to explain. They all understood the weight of memory, the phantom sensation of hunger that lingered decades after the last meal of deprivation. They were invisible to most Americans, their stories untold, their tears forgotten. But they had lived through something that shaped them forever. They had known hunger, and they had learned to eat again. In 1985, Isabelle's granddaughter, Emily, asked her about the war. Emily was writing a school paper and wanted to understand what her grandmother had experienced. Isabelle was in her 70s by then, her hair white, her hands marked by age and arthritis. She sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had fed her children and where she still insisted on serving meals family style, everyone taking what they needed but never more than they could finish. She looked at Emily's young face, so earnest and curious, and tried to find the words. "We had nothing," she said finally. "For years, we had nothing. And then the Americans came, and they gave us everything. I cried over a piece of bread, Emily. I cried because I had forgotten that bread could be soft and white and warm. Do you understand?" Emily nodded, though she did not really. How could she understand something so far removed from her own experience? She had grown up in suburban Kansas in the 1970s and 80s, where the refrigerator was always full and dinner was never in question. But she wrote down her grandmother's words carefully, sensing their importance, even if she could not fully grasp their meaning. Years later, when Isabelle had passed away in 1992, Emily found that school paper in a box of her old belongings. She read it again, now a woman with children of her own, and finally understood. Her grandmother had not just survived the war. She had carried it with her every day of her life, in every meal she prepared, in every scrap she saved, in every moment of quiet gratitude when the cupboards were full. The story of the French war brides, of the camps, of the tears over bread and meat, was not unique. It was replicated across Europe in different forms. Displaced persons, refugees, survivors of concentration camps, all encountered American abundance and reacted with the same mixture of disbelief and grief. The contrast between deprivation and plenty was too stark, too sudden, to process without emotion. Food became the symbol of everything the war had taken and everything the peace might restore. Historians later analyzed the camps, the logistics, the humanitarian effort. They calculated costs and outcomes, measured success in tons of food delivered and lives restored. But the numbers could not capture the human reality. They could not quantify the tears, the relief, the trauma, or the slow process of learning to trust that the food would not run out. The women who passed through the camps carried those experiences into their new lives, and their stories, passed down through generations, became part of the collective memory of the war. By the time the last camps closed in 1947, the world had changed. The Marshall Plan was underway, rebuilding Europe's infrastructure and economy. Food production in France slowly recovered. Rationing ended. Life, in small increments, returned to normal. But for those who had lived through the hunger, normal would never be quite the same. They had learned what it meant to be truly hungry, and they had learned what it meant to be saved. The camps, with their mess halls and their abundance, had been the bridge between those two realities. They had been the place where France's past met America's present, where tears fell over bread, and where the future began.